Welcome to session number 5. We are going to spend some time looking at how to analyze a property investment from a valuation perspective to establish the right price to pay, but more importantly, to establish what the intrinsic value of the property is. Let me begin by just defining a few terminologies, because I believe it would be quite useful in creating a framework for what we will be talking about. But more importantly, I believe it will be a useful framework to assist you in any future investment venture you might find yourself involved in. There is a huge confusion that exists whenever someone is, describing an opportunity, an asset, whether that be a company, a stock, a bond, a property. There is a huge confusion between these two terms, price and value. And I believe the best place to begin would be just to define some simple terms, and then we can move forward from that. The first term I'll define is speculation. And then perhaps I should have started with investing. The term investing is used very, very frequently to describe any and every decision that we make with regards to capital allocation. This assignment, or the assigning of this word to all capital allocation decisions, in my opinion, I think is incredibly wrong. It's asinine, in my opinion, and I will explain the reason. There is no known or generally accepted definition of investing. However, what we can define is what we call an investment operation. And please stay with me here, because this is very important, especially if you are about to make an investment in a property. For most people, your home or your first investment will be the most important you make. It would involve the use of capital, in many cases, capital that far exceeds what you're able to earn in 1 year. For some people, the capital that they are able to allocate towards purchasing a property comes from various sources: family, friends, personal savings, and most importantly, support from a bank, or support from a loan institution such as a mortgage company or a credit company. And so understanding what you're doing with regards to investing is important. Let me define what an investment operation is. Now, I refer to someone called Benjamin Graham. And Benjamin Graham was perhaps he's considered to be the father of what's called value investing. He was the first person who really put together a very comprehensive, I would say, principle or philosophy of investing. He was the one who taught Warren Buffett. He was his teacher. He was also the person who taught Charlie Munger. And Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett are partners. Both are considered to be perhaps one of the greatest investors of all time. Certainly Warren is considered the greatest investor of the 21st century. And all of what Warren learned was from Benjamin Graham. Benjamin Graham, and I'm sharing this information just in case there is an interest on your part to do some further research and study. Benjamin Graham prepared 2 different books. One was called security analysis, and the other was called the intelligent investor. And we all have to choose a philosophy. I believe with investing, the first thing you have to do is choose a philosophy in investing. That usually begins by studying various philosophies, and you find something that is very much tailored or suited to your personality and your character traits, and then you tailor this philosophy to your personality, and then you adapt the philosophy in such a way that it is consistent with your personal qualities, and with that you're able to develop a strategy which you apply to all your capital allocation decisions. So Benjamin Graham defined an investment operation as one which, upon thorough analysis, promises a security on your principal and a satisfactory return. I'll define that again. Benjamin Graham said that an investment operation is one which, upon thorough analysis, promises security of your principal or your capital and also a satisfactory return. There are three areas of that definition that I'd like to draw your attention to. The first is, he said, thorough analysis. This means in order for you to consider something to be an investment, you must undergo some form of detailed analytical process. It's meant to be based on facts and based on reasoning rather than emotion. So that's the first part. The second is that preservation of principle. And this simply means that whatever money you allocate, the money has to be preserved. As a matter of fact, Warren Buffett says that the first rule of investing, rule number 1, he says, don't lose money. And he says, rule number 2, don't forget rule 1. Very simple. In other words, you must preserve your capital, because if you lose your capital, you're out of the game. And the number 3 from that definition is satisfactory return. Now, satisfactory is a subjective word. This simply means you might decide that an investment that gives you 3% is satisfactory, 6% is satisfactory, 10% is satisfactory. It's down to you to decide. Now, this definition is such that if an operation does not fit within this definition, we call that speculation. I'll put it in a different way. If whatever you're allocating capital to has come about in the absence of thorough analysis, and there's a lot of risk that you might lose your capital or your principal, and the return doesn't exist, then you are speculating. It's very simple. Now, why have I taken this time to explain this? Well, the reason is because when it comes to asset allocation, many people make mistakes. We believe that once we find something that we find attractive, or once we find something that other people consider to be attractive, that is investing. In my opinion, until you're able to go through these 3 subject areas, you are not investing. So the first part of what we'll look at as we move forward is to understand, when it comes to real estate is a form, or a building is a form of an asset. And therefore, in order for you to understand what the value of the asset is, you must be able to quantitatively establish what the value is. One of the best ways of describing the value is something that we call intrinsic value. The intrinsic value of an asset is simply the discounted cash flow of the asset over the life of the asset. In other words, is the present value of the future cash flow. I'll put it in a different definition. The intrinsic value of an asset is simply the cash flow the asset will generate over its entire lifetime, discounted back at a discount rate. In other words, this asset will give you cash flow in year 1, cash flow in year 2, cash flow in year 3, all the way up until the end, maybe up until you get rid of the asset. All of this cash flow equals what we call the intrinsic value. This simply means for an asset to be considered an investment, there must be evidence that it generates cash flow in the present or sometime in the future. So properties normally, when you're about to buy a property, you might look on a website, a multi-listing website, and you will see so many properties with different values. I'm going to use 500,000 as the example as I explain further. You find a property, let's say it's a 2-bedroom property, and it's listed for 500,000. You find another property, it's listed for 550,000. You find another property, it's listed for 525,000. And this is by the agent. My first question to you is, did the agent estimate the intrinsic value of each of those properties? The answer is no. Sales agents do not calculate the estimated intrinsic value of an asset. What they do is they price the asset. And pricing simply means they use what's called comparisons. So it's meant to be a comparative valuation. We call that relative valuation. This simply means if a property comes on the market, on the street, say Sloane Square, what the agent will do is look back and see how many properties have sold in the recent period of the same type, along the same street or in the same area. And they might say, well, if a property last month sold for 500,000, then we believe this should be about 525. We believe it should sell for no less than 500. We start with 525 and hopefully we arrive at 500. So what the agent will do is compare the last sold property in the street or in the local area to the property you're about to purchase. It's simply called pricing. In other words, you're using historic information. Now, here you come along and you're about to buy a property. The agent has said this property is worth 500,000. My question to you is, what do you pay for the property? Do you pay the asking price? Or do you try and establish a bargain and buy for less than the asking price? The only way you can establish the value of this property is to go through a process of estimating the intrinsic value. And the best way to estimate the intrinsic value, in my opinion, is by using something called the DCF approach. There are so many approaches. This is called the discounted cash flow method. This simply means you estimate the cash flow that this asset would generate over the time period that you intend to hold the asset. You discount it back. And let me just explain something so you, just in case there's some confusion. When I use the word discounted cash flow, The point I'm making here is that this asset will generate cash flow 1, cash flow 2, cash flow 3, cash flow 4, year number 4, 3, 2, 1. Let me use an example. If this property generates a cash flow of 20,000 in year number 1, and 21,000 in year number 2, and 22,000 in year number 3, and 23,000 in year number 4. The question is, what is the value of all this cash flow in today's time frame? What that means is you have to recognize something called the time value of money. It simply means money in the hand today has more value today. 20,000 today has more value than 20,000 in 4 years, because as time goes along, as a result of inflation or the depreciation of the asset or money, the purchasing power in 4 years will be less than the purchasing power today. And therefore, what you have to do is take whatever cash flow in the future, and you have to bring this cash flow back to today, which would mean that 23,000 in the future, if you were discounting this back, it could be worth only about 18,000 today. And that is all that occurs when you discount cash flows. It's really that simple. So we come back to this example. What do you do? Well, it's quite simple. You have to estimate the intrinsic value. I'm going to give you 3 ways of establishing what the property is worth or what its value could be. The first approach is the one I've described. You estimate the discounted cash flow based on the income the property can generate. The second approach is what we call the cost approach. And this means you imagine that a property like this that exists, if this property was built in 1905, if you were going to rebuild a property like this today, what would be the cost? So this cost approach simply means you look at what would it cost to rebuild the property. But what you do is you establish the cost of rebuilding this property, and then you have to remove or discount the depreciation. In other words, 2 properties, very similar. One is built in 1905, one is built in 2020. What is the difference? The difference is that this property would have depreciated by 2020. And so to establish what the value of this would be, you can estimate what the cost of constructing a new building would be, and then you subtract the depreciation over the whole period. And that would give you the value of this property. However, there are 3 areas when it comes to depreciation we must consider. There's functional, there's economic, there's physical. And so you must make sure that you take that into account. Physical simply means age. The building is aging. If it's brick, the brick needs to be repaired, some need to be replaced. Economic simply refers to the economic depreciation. In other words, the time value of money. And then functional relates to the fact that there are some parts of the building, for example, you might have some dated plumbing, you might have some old porch. So it's simply a case of saying the function has changed. Now, the third way of doing this is a comparable approach. And here we go back to relative valuation, where we say we can compare the property to another property on the street. The best way of doing this is to use what we call a multiple. What is a multiple? A multiple is simply where we say this property is worth 500,000. However, the cost to construct a property like that is roughly £10,000 per square meter. If property A sold for 500,000 but was only 80 meters square, then you would say property A is 500,000 divided by 80. This is 4,2, so that's 12,000. 4, 2, 25, 2, 12.5. So what you could do is you can establish what the value of the property would be. So this is 5.6. There you go. 5. So I'm sorry, my math is just off today. 6,250. So 6,250,000 per square meter. So you would say, well, if it's 6,250 pounds per square meter, you can compare this to another building that is about to sell. I think I've confused you here, so let me try and do that section again. A property is sold on the street for 500,000. You look at the property floor area, and it's 80 square meter. 80 square meter would mean that this is roughly about 6,250 or 6,006.5. I'm not sure. I don't have a calculator to do that right now, but it's something in that region. If I was putting 80 here, just to do it, 2, this is 4, 2, 25, 2, 12.5, another 2, 6, 2, 5. So it's down. You would say this property is sold at a rate of 6.25 thousand per meter square. You could use this as a benchmark where you could say the properties in that location would sell for roughly 6,000 to 7,000 per meter square. Therefore, if you were to find a property that was 100 square meter, you would say, using the comparable approach, you would simply say that at 6.25, the property is roughly about 65k. Once you've done this, then you make adjustments, because when you sell or when you buy a property, there are known and there are unknowns. In other words, the known is the price paid. The unknown are the terms under which the transaction was completed. For example, the person may have sold this at 500,000 with some additional conditions. So he may have sold it at a lower price on the agreement that the buyer would maybe make some additional concessions. So you can't always look at the price of property sold and use that as a basis. And this is the reason why the comparable approach is the least favorable. However, is the fastest way to establish the value or the approximate worth, not the intrinsic value, but what a property could be worth. So the reason I made reference to those 3 approaches is your job is to take the 3 approaches and you triangulate. In other words, what you're trying to establish is whether your estimation, once you've done the 3 analysis, gives you a range that sits somewhere in that location. For example, if you establish that the intrinsic value of a property was 400,000, this is option 1, and option 2, you establish that the cost to rebuild was 600 and the comparable approach was 700. You would say that there is no uniformity in the three different approaches, that something is off. My recommendation is always this. Always go with the intrinsic value, because the intrinsic value is based on the actual income the property will prepare and produce for you. Now, let me move forward. Again, just to summarize, just that section, you have three options when you're trying to analyze and identify what the value of a property could be. The first is you can establish what the intrinsic value is. You can also go down the path of saying, okay, I cannot do the intrinsic value, so I'm going to price the property. If you were pricing the property, you could use what we call the cost approach, by looking at what it would cost to rebuild. What's the cost for constructing a property of that size, type, today? In doing that, you would identify the cost of construction, then you would subtract the depreciation, and that would give you what the approximate cost would be to rebuild. In other words, this is simply construction cost approach. And then number three, you can say, well, I like to identify what the cost would be per meter square. Again, these two options, you're doing what we call pricing. You're doing what we call relative valuation. With the first option, you're doing intrinsic valuation. This is the most important. You must be able to do that, irrespective of what you're buying the property for. You must be able to establish. Now, here is the reason why I make reference to the fact that the first option is the preferred. I gave you a definition of investing. I said investing is simply an operation whereby, upon thorough analysis, your principal is preserved and you're provided with a return that is satisfactory to you. If you were to look at these three approaches, you would notice that the intrinsic valuation is the only approach that guarantees that, number one, you do a thorough analysis. It's the only approach that guarantees that your principal is preserved, and it's the only approach that guarantees that the satisfaction that you would get from the return will be something that you're happy with. And the reason is simply because if you were to follow the cost approach, cost of materials increase and they decrease over time. And this simply means that the cost of construction will vary. It will be adjusted to inflation. If you use the cost approach comparison, the fact that a property sold for £6,000 per square meter, that's simply based on someone's opinion. It has not come from detailed analysis, and it's not based on the analysis of the facts and the findings. It's simply based on what other people are willing to pay. They could also change. So the intrinsic value, or the valuation, I'm using the intrinsic approach, in my opinion, is what I would recommend you understand and you study. I would say when you're doing your very first review of a property, it's okay to use the cost approach. It's okay to use the construction approach. But if you can, always use the intrinsic value approach. Now, I hope that's been useful. In the subsequent sessions, I will go into detail on each of these so that you have the ammunition, you have the understanding of what to do when you find a property that you are or that you have an interest in. Well, I hope it's been useful.